She thought that her only escape was to flee to the woods around her home. But what she did not know is that it would also be her doom. Hi, my name is Shar, and this is the And Other Stories podcast, where I tell stories of the supernatural and criminal, both real and fictional. Works of fiction written by me. The woods. She tried to steady her breathing as she ran. Her ears pricked for any sounds coming from behind her. Branches whipped and roots pulled, the coolness of the shaded wood chilling her face, her breath coming as steam through her icy lips. She climbed over a rock and landed with a sharp thump on the sodden brown leaves, crouching and straining to listen. He had been passed out, again, when she crept out the front door, squeezing herself through the smallest possible crack so the squeaky hinges didn't betray her. All across the overgrown grass she had run, feeling the wide, empty stare of the windows on her back all the way to the edge of the trees, praying he was still unconscious in his drunken stupor. She had not stopped running. Her breathing slowed as she stayed still, listening, her muscles screaming in protest at her cramped position. Even if he had awoken from his blackout, there was no way he could get this far into the woods any time soon. He could barely make it across the room in that state. She dared to elevate herself slightly to peer over the top of the moss-covered rock. The woods remained quiet and empty, the close-growing trees hinting of hiding places and spying eyes, the perfect place to watch. She took several more minutes in her chosen hiding spot, eyes darting at every movement, the wave of a branch, the falling of a leaf. She turned and looked further into the woods. She had two choices: stay here, or keep on deeper into the woods. Going back was not an option. With great difficulty, she tore herself away from the rock, stood upright, and started to march away, directly away from the house, throwing glances over her shoulder every few seconds, unable to shake her fear that he was following. Her feet found an easy path through the bracken and festering leaves, advancing forward with a calm confidence that she could find her way through and out. She had grown up in these woods, had never left the town where she was born. She had even met him there and foolishly married, young and in love. How fast that had changed. The thought made her head spin. As much as she hated him, her throat still started to close with a lump, and her eyes stung with the pain and sadness of losing the person she thought he had been. She didn't stop walking until the sun had dipped so low that she started to stumble on unseen rocks and roots. She stopped and squinted through the gathering gloom until she saw what she was looking for. Up ahead was a slightly brighter patch of woods, where she could see the trees were much sparser. Carefully she made her way there. The birds had become much louder, all shouting about the setting sun, perched safely up in the trees, out of anyone's reach. The rucksack she carried on her back was small and held meagre supplies. She had not wanted to make him suspicious, so she had packed only what she knew he would not miss, although in his case, she knew that would only include the liquor going missing. Thankfully, The tent they had used on their honeymoon was still sat where they had left it in the garage, covered in dust from lying abandoned for years. She quickly raised the tent and deftly started a fire from gathered wood, feeling a wonderful sense of freedom at fending for herself in the wilderness. It had been so long. The days-long flight and surge of adrenaline had left her weak and exhausted now that she had stopped to rest. Her nervous stomach could only take a couple of crackers before she had only the energy to crawl into her tent and sleeping bag and watch the glow of her fire through the canvas as her eyelids sank heavily, plunging her into sleep. Her dream mixed with reality as her brain struggled back into consciousness. Something had woken her, but she couldn't be sure what. As her mind cleared, her adrenaline started to surge once more, heightening her senses. She could still see a slight red glow through her tent of her dying campfire, the burnt wood cracking and popping quietly. There was no wind, and everything seemed silent. She had remained still listening, but now she started to rise in her sleeping bag, the shiny material rustling gently as she moved. A loud crack to her left started her heart pounding. She stayed as still as she could, her lips pinched tightly between her teeth, trying to breathe silently. As the minutes ticked by and she heard nothing more, she started to rationalize in her head. Plenty of animals roamed these woods. A deer or fox could easily have walked nearby and made that noise. Besides, if it was him, she would have probably been dead already. Her heart slowed and she started to relax her muscles. She was preparing to lie back down when she heard something far off in the distance, off to her left. A very distinct whoop. She abandoned her plan and listened carefully. About 30 seconds went by before, far off to her right, a longer whoop came through the darkness. It was far enough away that she could not make out the cadence of the noise. Could it be some strange animal? She sat longer, tensed once again, her fear locking her joints. All of a sudden, the woods came alive with noise. Whoops and howls, far and near, quiet then screamed, came from all around her. She frantically scrambled out of her sleeping bag and perched on her toes, unsure of what to do. She had brought no weapon. It was pitch black outside, and if she tried to run, she wouldn't get far. As she was contemplating her escape, she became aware of a soft sound right outside her tent. The scuff, scuff of footsteps through dead leaves were moving up and down just past her campfire. Scuff, scuff to the left. Scuff, scuff, scuff to the right. Over and over. She daren't move. The footsteps would stop occasionally. Sometimes it would kick her dying fire. Sometimes it would seem to be leaving. But then the noise would come back and resume its pacing. The terror that seized her felt too much for her to bear. She felt at any moment she would lose her head completely and tear open the tent and run into the darkness. The hours ticked by. Her limbs went numb from indecision. The scuffer continued its demented pattern. Somewhere in the very late night, just as she felt that morning would never come and she would be trapped in this hell forever, there was the sound of a single bird starting to sing, and she became aware that she could see the vague outline of her zipped-up tent door. As if this had been a signal, the footsteps suddenly stopped, then launched into the forest, thud-thudding, until they faded away into the distance. She sat listening for 5 minutes, which felt like hours. When no sound except the birdsong came from outside her tent, she cautiously moved her stiff limbs out of their fixed position and reached for the zip. With a thudding heart, she looked out a small gap before opening the flap all the way and emerging to examine her surroundings. The charred remains of the fire had been spread all around her tent. Feathers had been dropped in a pile at one of the corner pegs, and some sticks had been arranged neatly, leaning against the canvas. She swiveled her head around the clearing, peering through the trees as far as she could in every direction. Visibility was good in the light of day, and she could not see anyone, not even a tent or fire. She wasted no time taking her tent down, and even in her exhausted state, she swiftly walked deeper into the forest, determined to put as much distance between her and whoever had been tormenting her last night. She knew these forests well, and she knew that if she kept going straight from her campsite, away from her previous home, she would be out by nightfall. The bag on her back felt 3 times heavier, and her legs moved like lead as she marched away from the clearing. Tree after tree, mile after mile, she kept herself moving at the fastest pace she could manage, all the while scanning her horizon for any sign of the edge of the woods. Noon came and went, the hot sun shining down through the gaps in the canopy, and her stomach gnawed at her as she refused to even stop for something to eat. Time was too precious. She should be out by now. Her mind searched for reason to stave off the panic that was engulfing her by the time the sun started to fade and the stars started to show. She was so sure of her route, so certain that the distance would be less than a day's journey. Although she felt like she couldn't go on, her feet cut and bloodied from blisters, she broke into a light jog, adrenaline pushing her forward. She could not stay there another night. She had to stop. The sun was all the way down now. The woods were pitch black around her. Exhaustion finally crippled her, and she slowly but deftly set up her tent and once more climbed in, comforted by the thought that she would surely find the edge of the woods tomorrow, and that she was far from him, and far from last night's campsite visitor. It must have been hours that she'd been asleep. Her face was cold, and her limbs were stiff from sleep, as she slowly clambered into consciousness. The sound that had woken her, the familiar whoop from the night before. Her heart leapt to a gallop as she sat up, her eyes seeing nothing in the blackness, her ears painfully alert. The whooping sound came from all around her again, and then the same shuffling as before, round and round the tent. She told herself it couldn't be possible. She had run for hours, over miles and miles, over rough terrain with no path. There was no way anyone could have followed her. And yet here were the same noises, the same shuffles as the night before, except they had changed slightly in their pattern. The footsteps seemed more frantic, more urgent, and then came the breathing. The great effort it seemed to take to shuffle its speed around the tent was causing erratic and hoarse breathing to fill what should have been the silence of the woods around her. Faster and faster the footsteps came, the breathing becoming louder with each step, as her terror rose with each step, anticipating some big crescendo when the intruder reached their maximum speed. Instead, just as she felt she could not take the frenzied steps any longer, they abruptly stopped, right beside the end of the tent where she was sat. Her lungs felt as if they would burst as she held her breath, listening to the raspy breathing of her mystery companion. They came closer, further down, nearer to the canvas, until she heard the gentle scrape of nails down the material and pressure on her arm as fingers were pushed against her tent. She was frozen in horror for several long seconds, not daring to move, until a whisper, startlingly close to her ear, said, "Where are you?" Her fear burst into an explosion of adrenaline, and she ripped herself out of the tent door from the floor up. She ran straight ahead in the dark as fast as she could, arms flailing in front of her, trying to feel for trees. Her feet stumbled several times as she sprinted, sobbing, her breath coming in painful gasps, trying to get as far from the tent as possible. After several minutes of running, arms scratched and bruised from running into branches, she had to slow slightly, her lungs burning from exertion. The sky was starting to turn grey. A lone bird in the distance had started its song, but there was no other sound. She had no idea where she was. This part of the woods looked the same as any other. She still feared her intruder would be following her. She had not gone far enough, and it had followed her all the way from her last campsite. So all she could think to do was to keep going, in the same direction, away from her tent. Her feet moved of their own accord. Her vision was swimming from fear and exhaustion. Her mouth and lips were dry and cracking. She was looking around for a stream or even a puddle when she glanced up and saw something dark through the trees. As she drew closer, she saw old wood, a dark window, plants creeping up the walls. She altered her course, walking toward it, until she stood just outside. An old cabin, worn and ancient, stood in the woods, so close to the trees it looked like they had grown up with them. The walls were made of faded wood, the chimney of piled stones. She steadied herself for a moment against a tree, before she forced her feet forward and walked towards the door. Thank you for listening. I hope you liked it. My name is Shar, and this is the And Other Stories podcast. See you next time.